It's high noon in Connecticut, and we are very pleased to be serving as your judges for this We the People competition. When you introduce yourselves, please make sure that you introduce the star of the show, which is your teacher and coaches. My name is Tom Tinder, and I'm an attorney from Charleston, West Virginia.
I'm Steve Frenzik. I'm a retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy.
I'm Diana Owen. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon,
And
judges. I'm sorry. Good afternoon,
No, go ahead.
judges. We are Unit 6. Our unit focuses on the challenges that face our democracy in the 21st century. My name is Amanda, and I'll be studying psychology this fall at the University of Connecticut.
Hello, my name is Jack, and I will also be attending the University of Connecticut this fall, and I will be majoring in computer science.
Hi, my name is Callan, and I'll be studying dental hygiene at the University of New Haven this fall. But for now, we're all seniors at Trumbull High School. This is our teacher, Ms. Bolin, and we thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Let me read the question. Today, we're going to do question number 2. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Close quote. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? And to what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? You may begin.
President Franklin Roosevelt said, "Great power involves great responsibility." The United States' transformation from a small industrializing nation to a global superpower brought with it great responsibility. Our international presence now spans every corner of the globe. Americans have been involved in military conflicts in nearly every continent, and dozens of countries rely on billions of American aid for their own political and economic stability.
In his 1961 farewell address, President Eisenhower issued a solemn warning about the skyrocketing spending of the U.S. defense industry, which had increased greatly after World War II. Coining the phrase military-industrial complex, he described the growing relationship between defense contractors like Boeing, seeking lucrative opportunities from the U.S. government, and the vibrant war chest at the disposal of the Pentagon.
Eisenhower believed these relationships would have grave implications as they were incentivized by the existence of conflict, not peace. He said that every gun that is made, every warship launched, is, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed. We agree. In our view, Eisenhower's concerns still exist because of a lack of transparency in the political process today.
The founders' deep skepticism toward standing armies manifested itself in the Constitution, which granted Congress the power to provide and maintain a navy, but stipulated that armies would be raised and supported as needed, essentially implying that there would be no standing army.
Few ideas were more widely accepted in early America than that of the danger of peacetime standing armies. This anti-standing army sentiment motivated colonial opposition to post-French and Indian War British policies, and intensified after the Boston Massacre.
To the Federalist, the ability of Congress to raise and support armies was necessary for defending the country from foreign enemies and maintaining security within its borders. To the Anti-Federalists, this was an enlargement of the national government's independence from state legislatures and left the door open for future abuses of a potential standing army.
For much of our nation's history, Americans were successful at staying out of unnecessary wars, and therefore had little need for a large military. When Congress saw fit to declare war, as on the few occasions from the War of 1812 to World War II, it did so while making provisions to raise the necessary numbers of men and materials.
Attitudes towards standing a military began to change in the years after World War II. By the 1960s, there existed a permanent state of near war against communist regimes in China and the Soviet Union, and bloody proxy wars waged in Southeast Asia, along with murky covert operations from Iran to Guatemala. Most importantly, the United States conscripted millions into an enormous standing army.
Today, nearly a quarter of every tax dollar collected by the American government goes directly to the military, surpassing the next best funded agency by a vast margin. Much of that money goes to a select few private corporations who enjoy cozy relationships with the government.
The Biden administration launched a review of our military's global presence in order to ensure that it is correctly sized and supports strategy. The United States needs to take a hard look at these bases and make cuts where appropriate. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut argued that some bases, especially those in the Gulf states, are not worth the risks that they create.
COVID-19 has severely affected the world's health and economy. To combat this in Italy, the Department of Defense gifted a $10 million package in partnership with the U.S. European Command and our embassy in Rome. We believe that this should be the role of the U.S. military overseas.
History will no doubt look back on the last 60 years since Eisenhower delivered his farewell address as one dominated by unnecessary executive police actions. We applaud President Biden's decision to bring home the troops in Afghanistan this year. Eisenhower's warning still rings true today and needs to be addressed.
Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you. And we have some questions for you. You mentioned there about covert operations and police actions. What can or should be done to rein in those sort of extra military activities?
I believe this starts with our leadership. As we saw the president or the general of the military take a photo op with President Trump at St. John's Church, this overwhelmingly mixes the military and our president when it's trying to detain protesters and calm riots. And I believe this sets a bad precedent for over militaristic use in the police and especially around protests.
I also think it's extremely important to understand the importance of a transparency in the political process, especially when it relates to the actions of our military in relation to the police force. I think that throughout the past decades, we have not seen huge transparency as to what's going on. And I think that an informed citizenry throughout the United States is important so that we could vote on these issues accordingly. And so I think that for the betterment of the nation as a whole, a better transparency from all political leaders in our government is a very important step to take.
Well, I agree with both Jack and Amanda. I believe that this starts on a domestic and an international level. We see that the United States military budget is $753 billion, while the education budget is much lower than that. And I understand that this is recognized on more of a state and local level. But think about if we funneled more money into community colleges and at the education system in the curriculum and how we can improve our domestic issues before we reach internationally.
Let me ask a question which is broader in Unit 6, and that is there's legislation now in a number of states to make election laws more strict. Do you think, first of all, why do you think that's coming up at this point in time? And do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it directly correlates to the fact that Shelby County versus Holder was completely stripped away and Section 4 and 5 no longer apply. So I believe overturning Shelby County versus Holder is where you start. And these laws then that were deemed outdated can now come back into play. And all the laws that are currently being passed to suppress voters across the country will be then suppressed.
If you look at our government right now, there's 200 plus voter suppression laws being passed in over 43 states across the country. And there are things in the Senate that are about to be passed that could address a lot of these issues. For example, the HR 1 bill that has been put forth in the Senate by the Democrats. And I think a big problem in government right now is this big polarization between both the Democrats and the Republicans. A great bill like HR 1 comes up that could address a lot of the voter suppression issues that we are facing throughout the country. And yet Republicans are finding little things and details that they could object to. And I think that polarization is a massive problem in our government, and to address these voter suppression laws accordingly, we need to find a way to compromise between the two parties.
I agree with Callan. Shelby County versus Holder needs to be overturned because it has resulted in things like photo ID laws in Texas where people need to present a photo ID, where many people living in poverty do not own those. VC versus Perry is a court case in Texas that resulted from this, and these ID requirements are limiting so many people from voting and so many voices from being heard. So the government does need to put the polarization aside and fix this issue.
So you mentioned throughout your presentation the word transparency and the need for there to be more transparency in terms of what the military industrial complex is kind of up to. Could you give some concrete examples of where transparency needs to become more apparent?
Transparency needs to become more apparent between the Commander-in-Chief and Congress. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 states that Congress has the power to fund the military and the budget, and that the military has to directly ask Congress to be funded. And I do believe that there isn't a clear communication between these, because as we see, we've been putting billions of dollars into the military with no real clear plan of where this money is going. And so I believe that this needs to be a fixed communication.
While I agree with Amanda, I think that the transparency comes through spreading our initiative as the United States. In a study done by the Pew Research Center in February, 20% of Americans said that they do not think spreading democracy should be our initiative in the United States, and yet 80% think it shouldn't. 20% think it shouldn't, and 80% think it should. So I think when we look at these percentages and see how our country is responding to things that are being done currently, we can work together better.
And if you look at the War Powers Resolution, which was an act put in place in order to give Congress more checks on the president's power as commander-in-chief, we see that this War Powers Resolution has not been put into good use since its induction into government. The past 4 presidents have actually violated this act and have not taken the proper steps in order to ensure its usage. And I think if we can't have a good transparency between our own commander-in-chief and our own United States Congress, then how are we going to have a good transparency between the government and its citizenry? So I think that there's a lot of steps that need to be taken in the government itself in terms of transparency before we could even talk about the transparency towards the United States citizens.
Following along on that, what action should be taken with the president not complying with the War Powers Act?
In 2011, 10 House Senate members actually tried to intercept Obama's initiative to send troops into Libya, and yet it fell through. So when we look at how each president is able to reauthorize this War Powers Resolution through authorization use of military force, that needs to be addressed, because every president does reauthorize it, and every single time, every presidency, there's a problem with their term. So I believe that the term limit with Congress needs to be addressed.
Presidents Clinton, Reagan, and Obama all broke the War Powers Resolution, and I believe Congress should have taken direct action once they found out that this was broken. I think as a solution to this issue that funding should be immediately taken from whatever militaristic expedition they wanted to proceed without alerting Congress, and this would show future presidents not to break this.
I think
Your generation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I was going to say your generation has a lower voting participation level than older generations. What can and should be done about that?
I think that a big problem when looking at voter turnouts, especially with the youth, and a big problem in our country today is the faith in our democratic systems. I mentioned previously this idea of polarization, and I think a good way to address this is good leadership in government. President Biden recently said the words of a president matter. And I could not agree with him more. I think that we need to start looking at compromising. President Biden himself should not only view his own Democratic Party side and what needs to be done, but also the Republican Party side, so that they could start to compromise and find common ground, so that for the common good of the nation, we could start moving in a more progressive rate.
I actually disagree with Jack. I think voting should be a requirement. We see that in the 2020 election, it was the highest turnout of voters we've ever seen. Yet in our local state election in Connecticut, only 30% participate. So when we see that low number and how our representatives don't truly represent us, how can we have faith in our representative system? So I do believe voting should be required to fix this.
I think in order to get the youth out and vote, they should use something that they use every day, social media. As we've seen, many organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement has over 4.3 million followers. And these other social justice and movements have such platforms on things like Instagram or Facebook that they could use this in order to entice people to vote.
I'm going to follow up on that, because social media is specifically something that I study, and I'm really interested in your take on that. The government seems a little bit reluctant in a way to, kind of use the social media in this way. Can you talk about some of the pros and cons of using social media to get, you already mentioned the pros, which is it could reach out, but what might be some of the limitations or cons?
I think that a very large con of social media in general, especially when regarding politics, is there's such a large tension right now between the two opposing sides. And I think that social media, because you are talking behind a screen, you're not talking to somebody's face. A problem that often arises is people are a little bit more, I don't know the word, rude than they would be in a face-to-face interaction. And I think that when it comes to politics, this is really not a good thing because it doesn't promote this idea that I've been talking about of compromise and finding common ground. It really just repels away from it.
The Fridays for Future movement is a climate change promotion movement that has spread over. Sorry, can I finish my thought?
Yes.
It is. It involves every single continent, and it is spread over billions of people because it's directly through social media. When 16-year-old Callan Benson started this, and it completely did not expect it to grow this fast, but she has almost every country involved, and the platform is strictly on social media, but the change is in person. So when we look at how the word spreads fast on social media, that can also harm us in the sense that it can become a trend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We now have some comments for you. You know, you said at the beginning that you were here to discuss challenges of American constitutional democracy and so forth. And so we took you at your word, and we challenged you to see what, not only in this particular area with the military industrial complex, but to see if you had some other opinions and ideas concerning democracy. And you passed with flying colors. You did a very good job of not only answering our questions about this specific question, but also some other important democracy questions that we had. I want to start out by saying that I was very impressed with your initial presentation because your 4-minute presentation, because it was a story. It wasn't just a spitting out of particular facts but it was a nice story that you wove to answer the questions that were posed to you and the sub questions in unit 6 and in our question today. I particularly liked that you gave different sides and disagreed, and you respectfully disagreed with your colleagues, which is something that we need more of in our public discourse today. I wanted to, and I was next up, I wanted to ask you about your comment that you made, the specific comment that you made about your Connecticut senator with dealing with bases in the Gulf states. I was very interested in what he's doing and what your opinion of what he's proposing would do or not do. Lack of transparency. Thank you for emphasizing that, because that has a big impact on everything we're doing now, and particularly in the government activities. Overall, I thought you did a very good job. You're to be commended for your knowledge and your leadership, and you've told us what you're planning to do in the immediate future. And I would only say to you, please continue not only in that immediate future into higher education, but also in with everything else that you do, because you're good citizens already. We need good citizens. Please use your leadership and your knowledge in your local communities, in your state, in your higher education institutions, and for our country. Best of luck to you. Thank you. Congratulations.
I agree with everything that Tom had to say. I like the fact that you brought in the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in terms of your presentation to take their views and see that they've got some contemporary application. The fact that you disagreed was a positive. It wasn't a negative in any way. I'd like to sit down and talk to you more about the partisanship question in terms of what we could do about that, if there's anything we can do about that, and whether transparency and partisanship are in conflict or they they can work out together. Also, I want you to remember that you're in a kind of a rarefied atmosphere here in terms of being in the national finals of We the People. So we expect a lot from you, beyond this, that you are part of that knowledgeable segment of the population, which has in the past moved our country forward, and now it's your turn.
I would also like to agree with both my colleagues. I thought you did a wonderful job with the presentation. I liked the way that you had a strong grasp of the constitutional issues as well as a historical context. I like the way that you tracked the way that America's attitudes toward the military have shifted over time and, tied it into key points in American history, War of 1812, World War II, the Cold War, and then bringing it even up to the present and what the Biden administration is doing, which we have not heard before. And I like the way that COVID was mentioned and the idea of humanitarian aid and the way that the military can act in that role as well. I had a lot of questions I didn't get to ask just because your opening statement was so strong. I wanted to learn more and continue the conversation. But the question that I asked about transparency, which is a term that you used, and then the follow-up to it in the questioning, I thought was really strong because all of you had a different perspective that you brought to answering the question. It's a complex concept, transparency, and each of you had provided a different view on what that can mean and its implications, and also tied it back in to specific, the war powers revolution and even the Pew study. So I thought that was great. I personally was just really, I had to jump on the social media question just because I was so interested in your perspectives on it. And I was very interested to hear what you had to say. Again, you talked about, tough issues that we're dealing with now, polarization, incivility, all of these kinds of things, which are, part of our participation. I also think you had, we of course were not assigned to do question one, but because I heard you talk about the domestic and international, I think that ties into the other question. So clearly we know that you have a good command of that as well. So great job. I also want to say that one of my very favorite students that I've had at Georgetown graduated from Trumbull High School, and he was on the team from Trumbull that actually won the national finals in his year. So, and he always pointed to his We the People experience as something that was formative, and he brought it with him as he went to college. And I'm sure that the same will be true for you. And for those of you going to UConn, I look forward to being a rival of yours next year in basketball as you've rejoined our league in the Big East. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.